Welcome to the channel. Here, we take the biggest and most confusing moments in history, science, and technology and break them down into simple explanations that anyone can understand. No jargon, no complicated theories, just clear storytelling. And today we're covering one of the most important stories of the modern world, the Cold War. A conflict with no official battles, but huge consequences. If you've ever wondered why the world looks the way it does today, why certain countries are allies, why tensions exist, and how nuclear weapons shaped global politics, this video will finally make it all click. If you enjoy easy explanations like this, consider subscribing. Now let's get started. The Cold War is one of the most important stories of the modern world, but also one of the most misunderstood. It was a war with no battlefields, no official declaration, and no dramatic final victory parade. Yet it shaped almost every political decision, every global conflict, and every major scientific breakthrough of the 20th century. And to understand the world today, its alliances, tensions, and power struggles, you need to understand the Cold War. So let's break it down simply, clearly, and without any jargon. The Cold War began at the end of World War II. Europe was destroyed, cities were in ruins, and millions of people needed help to rebuild. Into this vacuum stepped two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had been allies during the war, but only because they were fighting a common enemy. Once the war was over, their differences became impossible to ignore. The US believed in capitalism and democracy, while the Soviet Union believed in communism and a one-party state. Both sides were convinced they had the better system. Both sides feared the other might take over the world. And both sides were armed with some of the most powerful weapons in history. So what exactly was the Cold War? It was a long period of political tension, military rivalry, and ideological competition between the US and the USSR, lasting from about 1947 to 1991. But the key thing is, they never fought each other directly. Because both sides had nuclear weapons, a direct war would have destroyed both of them and possibly the entire world. So instead, they fought indirectly through influence alliances, proxy wars, espionage, and psychological pressure. Let's walk through the major moments starting with the late 1940s. After World War II, Europe needed massive economic help. The United States created the Marshall Plan, which sent billions of dollars to rebuild European countries. This wasn't just generosity, it also pulled countries toward the American side. In response, the Soviet Union tightened control over Eastern Europe, forming a group of communist states loyal to Moscow. Europe was now divided into East and West. In 1948, the Cold War turned into a real crisis with the Berlin Blockade. Berlin was a city split between East and West, but located deep inside Soviet territory. The Soviets cut off all roads and railways into West Berlin, hoping to force the US and its allies to abandon the city. Instead, the Americans launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year. Eventually, the Soviets backed down. It was a clear message neither side was willing to let the other gain an advantage. In 1949, the United States formed NATO, a military alliance that promised mutual defense. If one member was attacked, all members would respond. In 1955, the Soviet Union created its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. At this point, the world was officially divided into two armed camps. Meanwhile, both sides started building enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And this led to a strange and terrifying idea: mutually assured destruction. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would do the same. And both sides would be wiped out. It meant that neither side could ever actually use their weapons. The Cold War was based on fear, not fighting. But the competition didn't stop there. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War moved into space. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite. They sent Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. And the US panicked. Suddenly, it looked like the Soviets were ahead. So America invested heavily in science and technology. This eventually led to Apollo 11, when American astronauts landed on the moon in 1969. The space race was more than science. It was about prestige, power, and proving which system was superior. Then came the closest moment the world ever got to nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from the US. When America discovered them, the world froze. For 13 days, the two sides stared each other down. Some advisors urged military action. Others warned it would start World War III. In the end, both sides made a deal. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the US quietly removed its missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but it left a lasting lesson. Nuclear war is unwinnable. In the following decades, the Cold War spread across the globe through proxy wars. The United States and the Soviet Union supported different sides in conflicts around the world. In Korea, the peninsula was divided into North and South. In Vietnam, the US fought to stop the spread of communism. In Africa and Latin America, both powers funded groups and governments that aligned with their ideology. These wars were often brutal and devastating for the countries involved, even though the superpowers never fought each other directly. By the 1970s, both sides were exhausted. The cost of constant military buildup was enormous. So the US and the Soviet Union entered a period called Détente, which means relaxation of tensions. They signed agreements to limit nuclear weapons and opened communication channels to avoid misunderstandings. But détente didn't last forever. Tensions rose again in the late 1970s and early 1980s, fueled by conflicts like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was facing huge internal problems. Its economy was struggling, its technology was behind the West, and its political system was rigid and inefficient. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he introduced reforms. Perestroika aimed to restructure the economy. Glasnost opened the door to more transparency and freedom of information. But instead of saving the Soviet system, these reforms exposed its weaknesses. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments began to collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War, was torn down by ordinary people. Soon after East and West Germany reunited, the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. And just like that, the Cold War was over. Not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet collapse of one superpower. But what did the Cold War leave behind? A world dominated by the United States. A network of alliances like NATO that still shapes politics today. Countries whose borders, governments, and conflicts were influenced by Cold War decisions. A space age built on Cold War competition. And a lesson that nuclear war must never be allowed to happen. The Cold War is called cold because the two main sides never fought each other directly. But it was one of the most dangerous periods in human history. It influenced everything from science to cinema, from global politics to everyday life. And even though the Cold War ended more than 30 years ago, its shadow is still visible in today's tensions between major powers. Understanding the Cold War isn't just history. It's the key to understanding the world we live in right now. Thanks for watching Stay Curious, and if you want a follow-up video about the rise of the Soviet Union, the space race, or how nuclear weapons changed history, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video helped you understand the Cold War in a clear and simple way. It's one of those stories that's much easier to follow once you see how the timeline fits together. If you want a follow-up video on the space race, the fall of the Soviet Union, or how nuclear weapons changed world history, let me know in the comments. If this helped you, give it a like, and if you're new here, subscribe for more simple explanations just like this. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.